What does it mean to take away not just a man's life, but his very essence? Throughout the blood-soaked corridors of human history, castration has served as one of the most devastating tools of power, a weapon designed not merely to punish, but to erase. It stripped away manhood, identity, and autonomy in a single agonizing moment. This was never about mercy or justice. It was about control, humiliation, and the systematic destruction of the human spirit. From ancient empires to modern regimes, the methods evolved, but the message remained chillingly consistent. Some punishments are designed to echo through eternity. The practice of castration stretches back thousands of years, woven into the fabric of civilizations across every continent. In ancient Mesopotamia, Assyrian kings ordered the castration of conquered enemies, turning warriors into symbols of defeat. In China, the imperial court required eunuchs to serve within the forbidden city, creating an entire class of men whose bodies had been altered to ensure loyalty. The Byzantine Empire employed castration both as punishment and political strategy, removing potential rivals by rendering them ineligible for the throne. In each case, the removal of a man's reproductive capacity served a purpose far beyond the physical. It was a declaration of absolute dominance. But why castration? What made this particular form of mutilation so appealing to those in power? The answer lies in its psychological impact. Unlike execution, which ends suffering, castration forced victims to live with their loss, serving as walking reminders of their subjugation. It eliminated bloodlines, prevented rebellions before they could begin, and created a permanent underclass of servants who could never threaten succession. In harems, eunuchs guarded women precisely because they posed no reproductive threat. In religious contexts, castration represented ultimate sacrifice and devotion. The practice transcended mere punishment. It became a tool of social engineering, reshaping entire societies around the wounds it inflicted. The earliest and most widespread method combined the primitive simplicity of a sharp edge with the calculated cruelty of thermal torture. Across ancient Rome, Persia, and the Arabian kingdoms, castration by blade became standard procedure for creating palace servants, punishing criminals, and eliminating political threats. The blade itself varied by region and era. Roman executioners favored the bronze coulter, a curved knife designed specifically for the procedure, while Arab practitioners used Damascus steel blades sharpened to razor precision. The instruments were displayed publicly before use, their gleaming surfaces catching sunlight as crowds gathered, transforming mutilation into spectacle. Victims were stripped naked and bound to posts or held down by multiple assistants, their legs forced apart to expose the genitals fully. The cutting technique followed a brutal logic. Executioners would grasp the scrotum firmly, pulling it taut to provide a clear cutting surface. A single stroke was considered the mark of an experienced castrator. Hesitation or multiple cuts increased blood loss and suffering unnecessarily. The blade would slice through skin, muscle, and connective tissue in one fluid motion, severing the testicles completely from the body. Some methods removed only the testicles, leaving the penis intact, while more thorough procedures excised the entire genital structure. The severed parts were often displayed to the crowd, held aloft as proof of completion, before being discarded into buckets or thrown to dogs waiting nearby. The victim's screams provided a soundtrack to the spectacle, rising in pitch as shock began to set in. But the blade was only the beginning. Immediately following the cut, attendants would approach with cauldrons of boiling oil, the liquid bubbling and spitting as it waited to receive human flesh. The oil served multiple purposes. It cauterized blood vessels, preventing immediate death from hemorrhage, and it destroyed tissue that might harbor infection. The application process was merciless. Using ladles or simply pouring directly from the pot, executioners would drench the open wound in scalding oil. The sound was distinctive, a wet sizzling as flesh cooked, accompanied by renewed screaming that often crescendoed into unconsciousness. The smell of burning meat filled the air, a nauseating sweetness that spectators would remember for years afterward. Those who remained conscious during the oiling often went into traumatic shock, their bodies convulsing as nervous systems overloaded. The survival rate for blade and oil castration varied dramatically depending on the skill of the castrator and the aftercare provided. In institutional settings like the Byzantine imperial palace, where eunuchs represented significant investments, survival rates might reach 70%. Professional castrators developed techniques to minimize fatal blood loss, applying tourniquets before cutting and monitoring victims closely during the critical first 48 hours. They knew which herbs might reduce infection risk and how to position the victim to prevent choking if vomiting occurred. In contrast, battlefield castrations or punitive procedures performed by inexperienced executioners killed the majority of victims. Records from Crusader chronicles describe fields littered with the bodies of castrated prisoners, left to bleed out or die from shock and exposure. Those who survived faced a transformation that went far beyond the physical wound. The immediate aftermath brought fever, delirium, and excruciating pain that could last for weeks. As healing progressed, the psychological impact deepened. Many eunuchs described feeling fundamentally altered, as if a part of their soul had been cut away along with their flesh. Sexual desire might persist, creating a torturous longing for experiences now impossible. Social identity shifted, no longer fully men in their society's eyes, yet not women either. Eunuchs occupied a liminal space marked by both privilege and profound loss. Some found purpose in their new roles, rising to positions of administrative power or religious authority. Others descended into despair, their survival feeling less like salvation and more like an extended punishment, worse than death itself. Fire transformed castration from a private punishment into a communal ritual, a public burning that served simultaneously as entertainment, deterrent, and assertion of authority. In medieval Europe and the Byzantine Empire, hot iron castration became the preferred method for dealing with adulterers, rapists, and political prisoners whose crimes demanded both punishment and spectacle. The procedure began with preparation of the iron itself, a specially forged tool with a circular or crescent-shaped head that would be heated in braziers until it glowed red or white with heat. Blacksmiths who crafted these instruments understood their purpose well, creating devices that would maximize surface contact with human flesh while remaining structurally sound under repeated use. The condemned would be brought to the town square or palace courtyard in chains, often after days of imprisonment designed to weaken resistance and heighten fear. Crowds gathered eagerly. Public punishment served as both moral instruction and perverse entertainment in societies where life was brutal and short. The victim would be secured to a wooden frame or stone platform, limbs spread and restrained with iron shackles that allowed no possibility of escape or even meaningful struggle. A herald would read the charges aloud, detailing the crimes that had brought the condemned to this moment. The recitation served to justify what was about to occur, transforming judicial brutality into righteous punishment in the minds of spectators. When the iron reached optimal temperature, the executioner would lift it from the coals, its surface radiating visible heat that distorted the air around it. The approach was deliberately slow, allowing the condemned to see what was coming, to feel the radiated warmth as the iron drew closer. Then came the application. The red-hot metal pressed firmly against the scrotum, held in place for several seconds as flesh seared and bubbled. The immediate response was a scream unlike any other sound humans produce, a noise that witnesses described as barely recognizable as coming from a human throat. The iron didn't cut, it burned through tissue, destroying everything it touched through sheer thermal energy. Blood vessels cauterized instantly, preventing the hemorrhaging that made blade castration so deadly, but the trade-off was agony of a different magnitude entirely. The burning often occurred in stages. After the initial application destroyed the testicles, the executioner might reheat the iron and apply it to the penis or to the surrounding area, ensuring complete destruction of reproductive capacity. Some procedures involved multiple irons of different sizes, each designed for specific anatomical targets. The smell became overwhelming, burning hair, cooking flesh, and the acrid stench of cauterized blood vessels combined into an odor that permeated clothing and lingered in the nostrils long after the event concluded. Spectators closest to the platform often covered their faces, but they rarely looked away. The victim's face told its own story, features contorted into expressions of pure agony, eyes bulging, veins standing out starkly against skin that had gone either deathly pale or flushed deep red. The aftermath of fire castration created a unique set of challenges and consequences. Unlike blade procedures, which left clean wounds that might heal relatively smoothly, burns created masses of dead tissue that sloughed away over days or weeks. The healing process was agonizing and prolonged, with victims often developing severe infections as necrotic flesh rotted while still attached to their bodies. Yet the cauterization meant that fewer victims died immediately from blood loss, resulting in higher short-term survival rates, a mercy that was also a curse, as it guaranteed extended suffering. The psychological trauma was devastating. Many fire castration survivors reported that the memory of the burning haunted them more than the loss itself. The sensation of heat and the smell of their own flesh cooking returning in nightmares for years. Some were displayed publicly during their recovery, their bandaged bodies serving as ongoing warnings to others who might contemplate similar crimes. In China, the creation of eunuchs evolved from crude punishment into a refined profession, practiced by specialists who operated from small shops in designated districts of Beijing and other major cities. These knife specialists represented a macabre intersection of medicine, economics, and social engineering. They developed standardized procedures designed to maximize survival rates while ensuring complete removal of reproductive organs. After all, a dead client represented lost investment and damaged reputation. The most famous of these establishments operated for generations, passing techniques from father to son, building businesses on the systematic mutilation of children. Families traveled from hundreds of miles away, bringing boys as young as 6 to be transformed into potential imperial servants. The economic calculation behind voluntary castration reveals the desperate poverty that gripped much of rural China. A position as a eunuch in the Forbidden City or a noble household represented the only avenue of upward mobility for boys born into destitute families. Parents who could barely feed their children saw castration as an investment. The suffering of one son might lift an entire family out of starvation. The knife specialists understood this dynamic and exploited it ruthlessly, charging fees that required families to save for years or fall into debt. Yet they also provided a genuine service in the transactional logic of the era. They offered expertise that meant the difference between a son who might rise to power and wealth and a son who died screaming in a pool of his own blood. The procedure itself followed a precise protocol refined over centuries. The boy would be brought to the specialist shop and prepared through a combination of ritual and practical measures. He would be bathed, his genital area shaved clean, and then subjected to the ritual of consent, asked 3 times whether he agreed to the procedure. This was pure theater, legal fiction designed to absolve the castrator of moral responsibility. What child truly comprehends such a choice? What desperately poor parents present it as anything other than necessary? After the 3rd affirmation, assistants would force the boy onto a heated platform called a kang, the warmth designed to increase blood flow and make vessels easier to identify and seal. His legs would be pulled apart and secured, his arms similarly restrained. The cutting technique employed by Chinese specialists differed from crude battlefield castrations. Using a small, curved blade, resembling a sickle, the castrator would tie a silk cord tightly around the base of both the scrotum and penis, creating a ligature that restricted blood flow to the area. This served to define the cutting line clearly and reduce immediate hemorrhage. Then, in a single swift motion, the specialist would slice through all genital tissue at once, scrotum, testicles, and penis removed as one piece. The speed was crucial. Hesitation caused unnecessary trauma and increased shock risk. Immediately after cutting, the castrator would insert a metal or wooden plug into the urethra, preventing the wound from sealing completely and ensuring the boy would still be able to urinate. Without this plug, the urethra would close during healing, creating a fatal blockage. The recovery period tested both the victim's physical endurance and the specialist's medical knowledge. The boy would be denied all fluids for 3 days, a brutal measure designed to minimize urine production while the initial healing occurred. During this time, he would be monitored constantly for signs of fatal complications, excessive bleeding, shock, or fever indicating infection. The pain during these first days was described by survivors as transcending physical sensation, becoming something that consumed consciousness entirely. When the plug was finally removed on the 3rd day, the ability to urinate was celebrated as a sign of successful castration. The alternative was agonizing death as the bladder ruptured. Those who survived the first week faced months of healing, during which the wound would be cleaned with carefully prepared solutions and bandaged repeatedly. Successful knife specialists maintained detailed records of their survival rates, advertising statistics to attract desperate families willing to gamble everything on their son's transformation. Among the most psychologically devastating methods of castration was the deliberate use of animals as instruments of mutilation. This practice emerged independently in several cultures, reflecting a sadistic creativity that sought not merely to punish, but to dehumanize completely. Historical records from medieval Europe, pre-colonial Africa, and parts of Southeast Asia document the training of dogs, pigs, and even primates to attack and consume human genitals specifically. The practice served multiple purposes. It transformed the victim into prey, stripped away any remaining dignity, and created a spectacle of horror that embedded itself in collective memory far more effectively than conventional execution. The training process for these animals was itself an exercise in calculated cruelty. Dogs selected for this purpose were typically hunting breeds or guard dogs already predisposed to aggression and strong bite force. Trainers would condition them to associate human genital scent with food rewards, gradually escalating from scent recognition to actual attack behaviors. Some accounts describe condemned criminals being used as training subjects, their deaths serving double duty as punishment and animal education. Pigs, with their omnivorous appetites and powerful jaws, required less training. Their natural tendency to eat nearly anything organic made them terrifyingly effective instruments once directed toward a restrained victim. The use of monkeys, documented primarily in certain Indonesian kingdoms, reflected a different psychology. The uncanny similarity between primate and human made the attack feel like a grotesque mockery of humanity itself. The execution of animal-assisted castration typically occurred in arena-like settings where maximum visibility ensured maximum psychological impact. The condemned would be secured to a post or platform, naked and spread-eagled, unable to protect themselves or flee. The chosen animal would then be introduced, sometimes starved beforehand to increase aggression, sometimes trained to respond to specific commands from handlers. When dogs were used, they were often released in pairs or packs, competing with each other to reach the victim first. The initial bite provoked screaming that often scattered birds from nearby trees and caused spectators to cover their ears despite their morbid fascination. Unlike swift blade cuts, animal attacks involved tearing and consumption, a process that could extend for many minutes. The physical trauma of animal-assisted castration was catastrophic, canine teeth designed to tear meat away from bone didn't make clean cuts. They ripped tissue, crushed structures, and created ragged wounds with massive surface area. Victims who survived the initial attack faced near-certain death from blood loss or infection, as the multiple puncture wounds and contamination from animal saliva made sepsis virtually inevitable. Yet survival, however rare, did occur. Medical texts from medieval Europe occasionally reference men who endured such attacks, their recoveries attributed to divine intervention rather than medical treatment. These survivors carried not only physical scars, but profound psychological trauma. Many reportedly could never tolerate proximity to dogs or other animals afterward, suffering what we would now recognize as severe PTSD triggered by even distant barking. The symbolic dimension of beast-assisted castration reveals its true purpose. By transforming human beings into prey, authorities communicated a message that transcended ordinary punishment. The condemned was being declared less than human, unworthy of even the minimal dignity afforded to criminals executed by conventional means. The practice also served as a dark mirror to society's relationship with violence and power. Spectators watched as the boundary between human and animal dissolved, as men were reduced to meat, their screams no different in essence from those of slaughtered livestock. This reduction was the point, to demonstrate that certain transgressions placed one beyond the protection of civilization entirely. In regions where this practice occurred, the threat of being fed to the dogs became a powerful tool of social control, a fate so horrifying that mere mention could enforce compliance. As human understanding of chemistry advanced, so too did the sophistication of cruelty. Chemical castration in its historical form, distinct from the hormonal treatments of the modern era, involved the application of corrosive substances directly to genital tissue, destroying reproductive capacity through controlled chemical burns. This method appeared across various civilizations, from ancient Egypt to medieval Islamic states, wherever alchemists and early chemists provided access to caustic materials. The substances varied: concentrated vinegar solutions, lye derived from wood ash, various acids and concoctions of plant-based irritants mixed into pastes. Each offered the same fundamental advantage over blade or fire. The destruction occurred gradually, allowing for precise control over the extent of damage. The application process transformed castration into a drawn-out ordeal rather than a single moment of acute trauma. Victims would be restrained as chemical preparations were applied directly to the scrotum and penis, sometimes painted on with brushes, other times administered via soaked cloths bound tightly in place. The initial sensation was often described as intense burning, as if the flesh itself was being consumed by invisible fire. Unlike thermal burns, which provided immediate feedback about the extent of damage, chemical burns continued working long after application, penetrating deeper into tissue as time passed. The condemned would be left in restraints for hours or even days, the caustic material slowly eating through skin, then muscle, then deeper structures, all while the victim remained conscious and aware. The choice of chemical agent reflected both availability and desired outcome. Concentrated vinegar solutions, while less immediately dramatic than stronger acids, had the advantage of predictability. Experienced practitioners could gauge dosing to destroy testicular tissue while theoretically preserving other structures. Lye-based preparations worked faster but less predictably, sometimes causing damage that extended far beyond intended targets. Some Islamic medical texts reference the use of specialized pastes containing arsenic compounds or plant toxins, like those derived from certain euphorbias, creating preparations that not only corroded tissue, but also caused systemic poisoning. The most horrific accounts describe the use of concentrated acids in later periods, substances that could reduce flesh to liquid slurry, leaving behind only connective tissue and bone. The physical consequences of chemical castration extended far beyond the immediate destruction of reproductive organs. The body's response to significant chemical burns includes massive inflammation, fluid shifts that can lead to shock, and the release of toxic breakdown products into the bloodstream as tissue dies. Victims often developed severe infections as the protective barrier of skin was completely compromised over large areas. The wound healing process was particularly problematic. Chemical burns create zones of progressive tissue death, meaning that damage continued spreading even after the caustic agent was removed or neutralized. Many victims experienced recurrent bouts of infection as dead tissue sloughed away over weeks or months, each episode bringing renewed risk of fatal sepsis. Yet perhaps the most insidious aspect of chemical castration was the psychological dimension of slow-motion destruction. Unlike the sharp shock of a blade or the immediate agony of fire, chemical methods allowed victims to experience their own mutilation as an extended process. They could feel the gradual progression of burning, could observe the physical changes as tissue broke down, could smell the distinctive odor of their own flesh liquefying. This extended awareness meant that the trauma was reinforced repeatedly over days, rather than compressed into a single terrible moment. Survivors reported that the memory of slow chemical destruction haunted them more persistently than sudden traumas might have, precisely because it had unfolded as a narrative rather than an instant, a story of progressive horror that the mind rehearsed endlessly. In this way, chemical castration achieved a depth of psychological scarring that matched or exceeded its physical devastation. The use of crushing force to destroy reproductive organs represents one of the most viscerally disturbing methods in the long history of castration, transforming the act from surgical precision to blunt trauma that reduced living tissue to pulp. This method appeared across multiple cultures, from ancient Persia to medieval Europe, anywhere that authorities sought to combine punishment with maximum suffering. The fundamental principle was simple: apply sufficient force to the testicles and surrounding structures to obliterate them completely, but do so slowly enough that the victim remained conscious throughout the process. The instruments varied from smooth river stones to specially designed mallets, from the hooves of horses to crude mechanical presses, but the outcome remained horrifyingly consistent. In its most primitive form, stone crushing required little more than 2 rocks and deliberate brutality. The victim would be restrained on their back, legs forced apart, and held in position by multiple assistants or binding restraints. The testicles would be positioned on a flat stone surface, sometimes a specially prepared altar or execution block with a slight depression to prevent them from rolling away. A second stone, often round and weighing several pounds, would then be used as the crushing implement. The executioner would place it on top of the genital organs and begin applying pressure, sometimes with their hands, sometimes by standing on the stone to add their full body weight. The pressure built gradually, allowing the victim to feel structures beginning to give way, to experience the sensation of their own anatomy being forcibly deformed. The physical process of crushing was a study in the limits of biological tissue. Initially, the skin would stretch and compress, turning deep red or purple as blood flow was disrupted. Pressure continued. Internal structures began to rupture. First, the delicate membranes within the testicles themselves, then blood vessels bursting in cascades that created massive hematomas. The pain response was immediate and overwhelming, activating every pain receptor in the genital region simultaneously. Unlike cuts, which severed nerves and might paradoxically reduce sensation in affected areas, crushing stimulated nerve endings continuously as tissue compressed and deformed. The victim's screams took on a particular quality that witnesses described as distinctly different from other forms of torture, a sound of pure agony, unmediated by shock or the body's protective dissociative responses. Mallet-based crushing offered executioners more control and theatrical possibility. Specialized mallets, often wooden with metal heads, were designed with flat striking surfaces that distributed force across the entire genital area. The condemned would be positioned similarly to stone-crushing victims, but the application of force came in repeated strikes rather than sustained pressure. Each blow delivered a spike of agony, with executioners sometimes pausing between strikes to allow the victim to fully process each wave of pain before delivering the next. Some accounts describe executioners asking questions between blows, demanding confessions or information, using the threat of the next strike as leverage. The rhythm of impact created a terrible anticipation. Victims could see the mallet rising, could track its descent, could do nothing but wait for the inevitable collision of wood and flesh. Perhaps the most elaborate and symbolically charged form of crushing involved the use of animals, specifically horses. In certain medieval European jurisdictions, condemned criminals were positioned beneath horses and the animals encouraged to step on their genital area repeatedly. This method carried particular symbolic weight. Horses represented nobility, power, and martial strength. Having them literally trample a man's masculinity underfoot communicated absolute domination. The unpredictability of the horse's movements added an element of psychological torture, as victims could never be certain when the next devastating impact would occur. The sheer weight of a horse's hoof, often exceeding 1,000 pounds, concentrated on a small surface area, meant that even a single direct strike could cause catastrophic damage. Multiple strikes reduced the area to destroyed tissue, crushed bone fragments, and hemorrhaging that was invariably fatal within hours. The death that followed crushing castration was particularly grim. Internal bleeding, infection, and toxic shock from the massive release of cellular contents into the bloodstream combined to create a prolonged and agonizing death. Among all the methods of castration documented throughout history, perhaps none was more psychologically complex than voluntary self-castration performed in states of religious ecstasy. The priests of Cybele, the Anatolian mother goddess whose cult spread throughout the Roman Empire, practiced ritual self-mutilation as their primary rite of initiation. Known as Galli, these priests would castrate themselves during frenzied celebrations, transforming permanent bodily modification into an act of divine devotion. This wasn't punishment or social control, it was sacrifice, transformation, and transcendence, all achieved through the deliberate destruction of one's own reproductive capacity. The phenomenon challenges our understanding of castration as something done to the powerless, revealing instead how religious fervor could motivate individuals to become architects of their own mutilation. The ritual of self-castration occurred during the Dies Sanguinis, the Day of Blood, which fell on March 24th in the Roman calendar. The festival built toward this climax through days of increasingly frenzied celebration, featuring wild music, ecstatic dancing, and sleep deprivation that pushed participants toward altered states of consciousness. On the culminating day, devotees would gather at the Temple of Cybele, surrounded by crowds of worshippers and the deafening sound of drums, flutes, and cymbals. The initiates, having worked themselves into states of religious ecstasy that contemporary witnesses described as divine madness, would seize sharp stones or ritual knives. Then, in full view of the assembled crowd, they would castrate themselves, severing their genitals completely and throwing the bloody remnants onto the statue of Cybele or into her temple. The psychological mechanisms enabling self-castration deserve careful examination. Modern analysis suggests that the combination of extended sleep deprivation, rhythmic music, group dynamics, and genuine religious conviction created a dissociative state where normal self-preservation instincts were temporarily overridden. The ecstatic state, characterized by feelings of unity with the divine, loss of individual identity, and profound euphoria, made the unthinkable possible. In this altered consciousness, the act of self-castration transformed from horrifying mutilation into sacred offering, the pain itself becoming a pathway to spiritual transcendence. Contemporary Roman observers struggled to comprehend this phenomenon. some attributing it to divine madness, others to mere barbarism, few understanding the complex psychology that enabled humans to willingly destroy their own flesh. The immediate aftermath of self-castration was chaotic and bloody. The newly made galley would be caught by temple attendants as shock set in, their wounds hastily bound with bandages. Some accounts suggest that priests skilled in medicine would assist with the immediate aftermath, applying substances to encourage clotting and reduce infection risk. Yet the crude nature of the self-inflicted wounds, jagged tears rather than clean cuts performed with whatever implement came to hand during the ecstatic frenzy, meant that complications were common and often fatal. Those who survived the initial blood loss and shock faced weeks of precarious recovery. Unlike institutional castrations performed by specialists with refined techniques, self-castration produced highly variable wounds, some relatively clean, others catastrophically destructive. The long-term existence of the galley reveals the aftermath of religious self-castration. Having permanently altered their bodies, these priests occupied a unique social position in Roman society, both revered as holy and despised as having willingly abandoned their masculinity. They adopted feminine clothing and mannerisms, grew their hair long, and lived entirely within the sphere of Cybele's worship. Many supported themselves through begging, wandering from city to city as living embodiments of devotion to the goddess. Roman citizens both feared and were fascinated by the galley, seeing in them a kind of religious commitment that exceeded even martyrdom. Martyrs died for their faith, but the galley lived on, their bodies permanently marked by their devotion. The psychological complexity of their existence cannot be overstated. They had willingly destroyed their own reproductive capacity, had literally and symbolically sacrificed their masculinity, yet found in this destruction a form of spiritual fulfillment that justified the permanent physical and social consequences they endured. Across continents and centuries, through 7 distinct yet thematically unified methods, castration served as humanity's most intimate form of power projection. From the swift blade to the slow burn of chemicals, from the crushing weight of stones to the ecstatic self-mutilation of religious devotees, each method tells the same fundamental story: the deliberate destruction of reproductive capacity as a tool of control, punishment, purification, or transcendence. What united these disparate practices was their shared understanding that to castrate a man was to do more than damage his body. It was to fundamentally alter his social existence, to strip away not just flesh, but identity, possibility, and future. The evolution of castration methods from crude to sophisticated reflects broader patterns in human technological development. Early civilizations wielded blades with brutal simplicity, their techniques refined only by trial and error, as they learned which cuts bled less and which cauterization methods worked better. Later societies applied emerging knowledge of chemistry and physiology to the same fundamental task, creating methods that were paradoxically both more humane in their reduced immediate lethality and more horrific in their prolonged suffering. The professionalization of castration in cultures like Imperial China demonstrated how even the most disturbing practices could become routine, transform from exceptional violence into mundane economic transaction. Yet technology and technique tell only part of the story. The persistence of castration across so many cultures and eras reveals something troubling about human social organization: the perceived necessity of creating permanent underclasses of altered individuals who could neither threaten succession nor reproduce their own kind. Eunuchs served functions that intact men could not, precisely because their modification marked them as fundamentally different. In harems, they guarded women without arousing jealousy. In palaces, they advised rulers without threatening to establish rival dynasties. In religious contexts, they embodied the ultimate sacrifice, having given not just life, but the very capacity to create life. The wound became the qualification. the psychological impact of castration extended far beyond the individual victims. Communities that witnessed public castrations absorbed lessons about power, about the consequences of transgression, about the lengths to which authorities would go to maintain control. The spectacle served pedagogical purposes, teaching through trauma, instructing through horror. Yet spectators also learned other lessons, perhaps unintended, that human cruelty knows few boundaries, that the body can be weaponized against itself, that suffering can be systematized and refined across generations. The crowds that gathered to watch castrations were themselves altered by the experience. Their understanding of human possibility and human depravity expanded with each scream. In examining these 7 methods, we confront uncomfortable truths about civilization itself. The societies that practiced castration most extensively were often those considered most advanced. Imperial China with its sophisticated bureaucracy, Rome with its legal system, Byzantium with its artistic achievements. Cultural sophistication did not preclude systematic cruelty. In many cases, it enabled and refined it. The techniques improved, the survival rates increased, the institutions became more efficient, but the fundamental act remained unchanged. The deliberate destruction of human reproductive capacity as an instrument of power. The screams may have faded into historical silence, but the echo of what they represented, humanity's capacity to transform the body into a battleground for control, continues to resonate through our understanding of power, punishment, and the depths of human cruelty.